I watched another woman wear my ring down the aisle at my son's wedding. Not a similar ring, my ring, the pear-cut sapphire I designed myself, set in rose gold I'd sketched on a napkin in 2003. She wore it on her right hand, catching the light every time she lifted her champagne glass, clearly under the impression it was simply a beautiful, generous gift from her husband. That's what nobody tells you about watching your old life get repurposed by someone new. You don't scream. You don't even feel much, not at first. You just quietly remember one detail the room had completely forgotten. You're the one who built the thing they're admiring. My name is Elena Marsh. I'm 52 years old. I live outside Denver, Colorado. For 22 years I was married to Richard Cole, a commercial real estate developer who built 3 shopping centers and one very large ego across our marriage. We have one son together, Adam, 29, a structural engineer who was, on this particular Saturday, marrying a wonderful woman named Preya in a vineyard outside Boulder. I've spent the last 18 years running a small, precise business most people don't think much about until they need it. Custom fine jewelry design, with a specialty in rare stone security and authentication. It is, in the most literal sense possible, the reason I happen to know exactly where my ex-husband's new wife had been sleeping 4 nights out of every week. Before I go further, wherever you're watching from tonight, Denver, Nashville, a hotel room somewhere between flights, drop your city in the comments, because I read every one of them, and this community has carried me through more than you know. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because we tell stories about quiet women who turn out to be paying much closer attention than anyone assumed. Here's my honest question for you tonight. If you designed something beautiful, gave it up in a divorce, and then watched it reappear on someone who had no idea what it was actually capable of, would you say something immediately? Or would you wait and see what she did with it first? Hold that thought. Because what I found on my own company's server, 4 months after that wedding, is something Richard's attorney still calls the cleanest fraud discovery he's seen in 20 years of family law. But first, you need to understand exactly how a marriage teaches a woman to build things that quietly outlast it. Richard and I met in 1998 at a trade show in Chicago, where I was exhibiting my first real jewelry line, and he was there scouting retail tenants for a development deal. He bought a bracelet for his mother, asked me to dinner, and told me, with total sincerity, that watching me talk about gemstone sourcing was the most interesting conversation he'd had in a year. I remember thinking, at the time, that a man who found gemstone sourcing genuinely interesting, rather than merely tolerable, was rare enough to take seriously. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony at my parents' house in Fort Collins, with a ring I'd designed myself over 11 months. A pear-cut sapphire, because Richard once mentioned, offhand, that sapphires reminded him of a lake his family used to visit, and I'd wanted to give him something that meant more than simply being expensive. For a long stretch, it was a genuinely good partnership. He built commercial properties. I built a design business one client at a time. And we were, by most outside measures, a couple who'd figured something out that a lot of people never do. He came to my early trade shows and carried boxes without complaint. I sat through countless zoning hearing dinners, nodding along to conversations about easements and anchor tenants I didn't fully understand but genuinely tried to. Adam was born in our 6th year of marriage, and for a while after that, the partnership only deepened. In the specific way new parenthood either breaks a marriage or welds it more tightly together. Ours, for a time, welded. The shift happened slowly, the way it almost always does, right around the time Richard closed his first major shopping center deal and his name started appearing in the regional business press. My business, meanwhile, was doing exactly what small specialty businesses do. Growing steadily, profitably, but quietly, the kind of success that doesn't make headlines even when it's genuinely excellent. There is a particular kind of erosion that happens when one partner's success becomes visible, and the other's stays quiet, even when the quiet one is, by any honest measure of revenue or skill, doing equally well. Richard started introducing me at industry dinners as my wife. She does the jewelry thing, which sounded harmless enough until you noticed how consistently the jewelry thing replaced any mention of the 22-carat sapphire necklace I designed for a client's museum donation, or the security patents my small team held for tamper-evident clasps used by 3 national retailers. The first real crack came at a company holiday party, when a colleague of his asked what I did and Richard answered before I could open my mouth, "She makes pretty things, keeps her busy." I remember smiling and correcting nothing, because correcting it in the moment felt smaller, somehow, than simply being excellent and letting the excellence eventually speak for itself. I had not yet learned that some rooms never let excellence speak for itself, unless you make them. The second crack came when one of Richard's own development partners needed a rare stone authentication service for a high-value insurance dispute, and asked, quite reasonably, if my company handled that kind of work. Richard laughed and said, "Let's keep this professional, Dale. I don't need my wife's little shop anywhere near a legal matter." My little shop, at the time, was already the authentication vendor of record for 2 regional auction houses. Dale found out the truth eventually, from someone else, and told me over lunch a year later that he'd always wondered why Richard seemed so oddly determined to keep the two of us in separate professional lanes. The third crack, and the one I never fully recovered from, came the year our marriage was quietly ending, though neither of us had said it out loud yet. I'd just been asked to speak on a jewelry industry security panel in New York. A real honor, the kind of invitation that doesn't come twice, and when I mentioned it at a family dinner, Richard's mother asked, warmly, what exactly I'd be discussing. Before I could answer, Richard said, with that same easy laugh, something about tiny tracking chips and earrings, I think. Very cute, very her. Tiny tracking chips. I had spent 4 years developing a discrete embedded authentication system now used by 3 major retailers to combat high-value jewelry theft and insurance fraud, and my husband had just described it to his own mother, in the same tone you'd use for a child's science fair project. We divorced 2 years later, amicably enough on paper, exhaustedly in practice. Richard kept the house. I kept my company, my client relationships, and, this detail matters more than it seemed to at the time, the master administrative account for every piece of jewelry I'd ever authenticated or secured, including a certain pear-cut sapphire ring I'd designed for my own engagement, which Richard in the settlement asked to keep for sentimental reasons, and which I let him have because at the time, I genuinely didn't think it mattered anymore. Richard remarried 18 months after our divorce, to a woman named Vanessa Kirby, 38, sharp, beautiful, and, I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to how this story actually unfolded, genuinely charming in the specific way that makes people want to believe the best about her. I met her twice before the wedding, both times brief and civil. She referred to me once, at a mutual event, as Richard's first chapter, delivered with a smile that was almost, but not quite, kind. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a clever line, the kind of thing you rehearse before you say it out loud, and I filed that observation away without fully understanding why it bothered me. I didn't think much about the ring until the day of Adam and Priya's wedding, when I watched Vanessa lift a champagne glass during the toasts, and catch the light on a pear-cut sapphire I would have recognized in complete darkness. Because I'd cut the setting angles myself, 23 years earlier, at a bench in the back of my first tiny studio. Richard had given her my ring, not a replica, not something new commissioned in a similar style. My actual ring, the one from the actual settlement. The one I'd let him keep for sentimental reasons, because I hadn't wanted to fight over an object during a divorce that already had enough objects to fight over. I said nothing that day. I hugged my son. I danced with old family friends. I watched Vanessa work the room with real skill. She was, I'll grant her this, extraordinarily good at making everyone she spoke to feel like the most interesting person at the table. And I drove home that night with a strange cold clarity settling into my chest. Not jealousy, exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't some of that too, but something closer to unfinished business. Because I knew something about that ring that neither Richard nor Vanessa had ever bothered to ask about, it wasn't just a beautiful object. It was, quite literally, a piece of my company's active security infrastructure. In the weeks after the wedding, I noticed something in myself I hadn't expected, a low, persistent hum of unease that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. I've built my entire career on trusting the specific feeling that arrives just before a piece of data confirms what your gut already suspected, and that feeling arrived early. Well before I had any actual reason to look twice at anything. I told myself it was simply old wounds resurfacing, watching another woman wear a piece of my own history, and for a while, I genuinely believed that was all it was. 4 months later, my operations manager flagged something routine during a system audit. An active authentication subscription still running under my company's original client account, tied to a ring whose ownership had technically transferred out of our contractual relationship years earlier, but whose embedded chip, designed for insurance-grade location verification in the event of theft, had simply never been formally deactivated, because nobody on Richard's side had ever thought to ask us to. I stared at that flag for a long time. I had every legal right to decommission the chip, immediately, quietly, and never think about it again. I also had, buried in a system I'd built myself, 18 months of anonymized location pings I hadn't asked for, and hadn't been looking at. The kind of passive data, our security service logs for every active client, purely for insurance fraud detection purposes. And purely, until that moment, background noise I had no reason to examine. I want to be honest about the exact sequence here, because precision matters to me, and it should matter to you too. I did not go looking for a scandal. What happened was smaller, and more clinical than that. My operations manager, doing her actual job, noticed a location pattern inconsistent with the address on file. A subscriber's ring pinging 4 nights a week, at a location roughly 40 minutes from the Cole family's registered residence, and flagged it as a potential fraud detection anomaly. Exactly the kind of flag our system exists to catch, because rings that spend that much unexplained time at a second address are, statistically, often stolen or duplicated. She brought it to me because I was, technically, still the account's original administrator of record. I looked at the address once. Then I looked at it a second time. Because the second address, cross-referenced against public property records, belonged to a man named Corey Whitfield, a name I recognized instantly, because Corey Whitfield had been Vanessa's business partner in a boutique event planning company for the better part of 6 years, well before she'd ever met Richard. I sat with that information for 3 full days before I did anything at all, because I understood, better than almost anyone, how easily a data point can be misread. 40 minutes from a marital home 4 nights a week could mean an affair. It could also mean a legitimate late-running business partnership, a family obligation, a dozen boring explanations that had nothing to do with betrayal. I am, by professional training, deeply suspicious of conclusions that arrive faster than the evidence actually supports. I have built an entire career on the specific discipline of not jumping to conclusions about gemstones, and I forced myself to apply that same discipline here, to a situation that involved my ex-husband and my own lingering feelings, which made the discipline considerably harder to hold on to than it usually is with a client's insurance claim. So I did what I do professionally, for a living. When a client suspects something is wrong with an asset they've insured, I built a complete, defensible, entirely legal picture before I said a single word to anyone. Our authentication logs, which exist specifically to protect clients from fraud and theft, are legally accessible to the account's registered administrator for exactly this kind of anomaly review. I had my company's general counsel confirm that in writing before I looked at another data point, because I refused to let my own personal history with these 2 people turn a legitimate business safeguard into something that could later be characterized as surveillance of a private citizen. That distinction mattered enormously to me, and it mattered even more once I understood what the pattern actually revealed. Over 6 weeks, working entirely within our documented, insurance-compliant monitoring protocol, I confirmed what the initial flag suggested: Vanessa's ring. Meaning, functionally, Vanessa herself had been at Corey Whitfield's residence with a frequency and duration that fit no reasonable business partnership explanation, particularly given that public records showed Corey Whitfield had dissolved their joint company entirely 2 years earlier, meaning there was no remaining professional relationship to explain the pattern at all. I cross-referenced the dates twice, then a third time, because I needed to be entirely certain before this became anything more than a private observation, sitting in a locked file on my own computer. There was a complication here that nearly stopped me from acting on any of it. About 5 weeks into the review, Richard called me directly, something he almost never did. Sounding uncharacteristically uncertain, saying he'd noticed Vanessa had been distracted lately, distant, and asking, almost sheepishly, if I had any advice, one adult to another, about reading the early signs of a marriage drifting. I sat on my back porch during that call, watching the light change over the mountains, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel toward Richard in years. Not romantic longing, but something quieter. A kind of tired compassion for a man walking directly toward a wound he had no idea was coming. For a moment, genuinely, I considered simply telling him everything right then, on that phone call, and being done with it. But something in me, the same instinct that has kept my authentication business honest and defensible for 18 years, insisted on doing this properly, through the correct channel, rather than as a phone call between exes trading gossip about a woman neither of us fully trusted anymore. I told Richard only that if something felt wrong, he should trust that feeling, and look into it directly himself. I did not mention the ring. Not yet. It was Adam, actually, who changed the timeline for me. 2 weeks later, at a family dinner, my son mentioned, almost in passing, that Vanessa had recently pushed hard for Richard to restructure his development company's ownership documents for tax efficiency. A restructuring that would have significantly increased her financial claim on the business in the event of a future divorce, filed conveniently just before their second wedding anniversary, which under Colorado law would have shifted several of Richard's premarital assets into the marital estate. Adam, an engineer with a sharp eye for structural problems of every kind, said it struck him as strange timing. I sat there, hearing my son unknowingly describe the second half of a pattern I'd already half confirmed with the ring's location data, and understood immediately that this was no longer just a private matter between Richard and Vanessa. It was, potentially, a serious threat to a company Adam himself held a minority stake in, one he'd worked years to earn. That's when I stopped waiting. I brought everything to Richard's attorney directly, not to Richard personally, and not through any dramatic confrontation, through the correct, boring, entirely proper channel of a formal legal disclosure. Because I understood that the moment this stopped being clinical and became personal, its credibility would collapse along with it. I called the attorney's office on a Tuesday morning, introduced myself formally, and asked for 15 minutes. I handed over the authentication logs, the property records, the restructuring documents Adam had unknowingly flagged, and a clear, dated timeline connecting all three, organized in the same precise, indexed way I organize every authentication case I've ever built for a client. I made one request, that my name stay out of any conversation with Richard until the attorney had independently verified everything, so that nothing could later be dismissed as a bitter ex-wife's manufactured story. The attorney verified it within 9 days, running the property records and financial filings through his own independent channels, rather than simply trusting mine, which I respected, because it meant that whatever came next would hold up regardless of how anyone felt about me personally. What emerged was worse, and more deliberate, than even I had suspected. Vanessa had in fact maintained her relationship with Corey Whitfield the entire length of her marriage to Richard, timed the ownership restructuring push specifically around the 2-year marital threshold, and had, this was the detail that finally moved Richard from disbelief to genuine fury, quietly consulted a divorce attorney of her own 4 months earlier, well before the restructuring conversation even began, laying out exactly the financial position she intended to be in once she filed. Richard confronted her the following week, in their own kitchen, with the documentation in hand, not because I orchestrated the moment, but because that's simply where these conversations happen. In the ordinary rooms where two people built an ordinary life together, on top of an extraordinary lie. Vanessa's response, according to Richard, was to attempt exactly the kind of reframe I imagined she'd used successfully before, that Richard was paranoid, that Corey was just an old friend going through a hard time, that the restructuring was purely financial planning. The documentation didn't allow for that story to survive contact with an actual timeline. Richard told me later that the moment she realized the property records and the attorney consultation dates couldn't be explained away, something in her expression changed entirely. The charm dropping away all at once, revealing, he said, someone considerably colder underneath than the woman he thought he'd married. The public reversal, when it came, wasn't loud, and I think that's important, because this was never a story that needed a scene. It happened at Adam and Priya's 1-year anniversary dinner, a small family gathering Vanessa had been expected to attend and, at the last minute, did not, because by then, the restructuring had been formally withdrawn, the marriage was in active, quiet collapse, and everyone at that table, including Richard, understood exactly why, even though nobody said Vanessa's name once during dinner. I remember the specific texture of that evening. Adam's in-laws were there, a handful of old family friends. The kind of gathering where absences get noticed but rarely commented on directly. Richard arrived alone, visibly thinner than the last time I'd seen him. The particular exhaustion of a man who has just discovered his second marriage was built on the same kind of calculation he'd once accused me, unfairly, of being too small to attempt. He was quieter than usual through the appetizers, and I found myself, against my own expectations, feeling something close to tenderness toward him. Not romantic. Not even entirely sympathetic, but the specific tenderness you feel for someone you once built an entire life with. Watching them survive a wound you happen to be the one who found first. Near the end of the evening, over dessert, Richard raised a glass, looked at me for a long moment, and said simply, "Elena built something years ago that ended up protecting this family, when I couldn't see the threat myself." I don't think I ever really understood what she did for a living until it saved all of us. The table went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone present understands more than they're saying out loud. Adam reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. I hadn't expected to cry at that dinner, and I did, quietly, dabbing at my eyes with a cloth napkin, while Priya's mother pretended not to notice. For reasons that had very little to do with vindication, and everything to do with finally being seen, in front of my own family, for the thing I'd built. Later that night, driving home alone through the dark, I thought about all the small dinners over all the years, where she makes pretty things had gone unchallenged, and I thought about how strange it was that the correction, when it finally arrived, came not from an argument I'd won, but from 22 years of quiet, unglamorous competence that simply happened to be there, doing its job, exactly when a family needed it most. It's been 6 months since that dinner. Richard's divorce from Vanessa is finalized. The ring, understandably, was returned as part of the settlement. And I now keep it in a security case at my studio, not because I want to wear it again, but because it feels right that the piece I designed with my own hands finally rests somewhere I actually control. Richard and I are, strangely, better co-parents and better friends now than we managed to be for most of our marriage. Grief and gratitude have a way of clarifying people, when they let it. He's told me twice now, in quieter moments, that he's spent a fair amount of time reconsidering exactly how many years he spent describing my life's work in language that made it sound smaller than his own, and I believe him, though I've also stopped needing that reconsideration the way I might have needed it years ago. Adam's business stake in Richard's company remains fully intact. The restructuring that would have complicated his future ownership never went through. And I like to think that matters more, in the long run, than anything that happened between Richard and Vanessa personally. Priya, my daughter-in-law, told me recently, half laughing, that she now refers to me privately as the mother-in-law with the secret spy jewelry, which isn't quite accurate, but isn't quite wrong either, and I've decided I don't mind the reputation. Corey Whitfield, for what it's worth, has not resurfaced in any of our lives since. Vanessa, I'm told, has moved to Arizona. I genuinely wish her well, in the distant, uncomplicated way you can wish well for someone once every practical consequence of their choices has already landed exactly where it needed to. Here's what I want you to sit with tonight. For years, I let she makes pretty things and tiny tracking chips, very cute sit unchallenged at family dinners, because correcting it in the moment always felt like more effort than it was worth. I want to be honest with you. I don't think I was wrong to let those moments pass quietly. I think the mistake would have been believing, the way I sometimes did, that the diminishment was actually true. It never was. I kept building the whole time, exactly as precisely and quietly as I'd always built everything. And it turned out that precision, given enough time, protects people far more reliably than any argument I could have won at a dinner table 20 years ago. I think often about the version of this story where I deactivated that chip the moment I noticed the flag, the way I had every right to. It would have been simpler. Nobody would have faulted me for it. But I've come to believe that the years I spent building an honest, careful, well-documented business, the very same discipline Richard once reduced to a punchline about earrings, were never really about proving anything to him at all. They were about becoming, slowly and without an audience, someone capable of protecting the people I loved, when it actually mattered, whether or not anyone in the room understood what I was doing at the time. So here's my question for you tonight. Is there something you built quietly? Something someone in your life once dismissed as small or cute, or just a hobby, that ended up mattering more than either of you expected? Tell me in the comments, along with your city, because somebody scrolling tonight needs to hear that the quiet, careful thing you're building right now is not nothing. Even if nobody in the room understands it yet, take care of yourselves. And remember, the things you build with real precision have a way of outlasting the people who once called them small.